In the autumn of 1944, German panzer commanders in France faced an enemy they could not understand. Their Tigers and Panthers were the most feared tanks in the world. 60 tons of steel and firepower that could destroy any Allied vehicle at 2,000 meters. Yet something was hunting them in the fog and hedgerows of Lorraine. Something that appeared from nowhere, fired once, and vanished before their turrets could traverse. Something they could not hit. 700 miles away, in a factory in Flint, Michigan, workers at Buick Motor Division were building the weapon that would humble the vaunted German armor. It weighed half as much as a Sherman tank. Its armor could be penetrated by a rifle bullet at close range. Military experts on both sides said it was a death trap on tracks. The Germans believed heavy armor won tank battles. The Americans were about to prove them catastrophically wrong. The misjudgment began with doctrine. German armored warfare was built on a simple principle that had proven itself across Europe. Thickness equaled survival. The Panther tank carried 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, angled at 55 degrees from vertical, creating effective protection equivalent to 140 millimeters of flat steel. The Tiger one carried 100 millimeters on its face, backed by another 120 millimeters on its gun mantlet. These were rolling fortresses designed to absorb punishment and destroy enemies at ranges where enemy guns could not reply effectively. German engineers added armor with every new design because armor saved crews and armor won battles. When the Tiger II entered service in 1944, it carried 150 millimeters of frontal protection. The Tiger tank destroyer mounted 250 millimeters. More steel, more protection, more victory. This was the lesson Germany had learned. This philosophy had conquered Poland in 35 days. It had crushed France in 6 weeks. It had driven deep into the Soviet Union, destroying thousands of Soviet tanks in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. German panzer commanders knew what worked because they had made it work across a continent. They expected the Americans to fight the same way, trading armor for armor, slug for slug, the heaviest tank winning each engagement. They studied American armored vehicles and found them wanting. The Sherman tank carried barely 50 millimeters of frontal armor, far less than German medium tanks. American tank destroyers like the M10 were even more lightly protected and mounted their guns in open-topped turrets that left crews vulnerable to artillery fragments and infantry weapons. German intelligence compiled detailed assessments. They noted the Americans prioritized mobility and production over protection. This appeared to be a critical strategic error that German crews would exploit on the battlefield. How could thin-skinned vehicles survive against Panthers and Tigers? The answer seemed obvious. They could not. What the Germans did not understand was that the Americans were playing an entirely different game. The man who changed everything was a World War I veteran named Andrew Davis Bruce. Born in 1894 in St. Louis, Missouri, he had served as an infantry officer in the American Expeditionary Forces. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in 2 separate engagements, near Vierzy, France, during the Aisne-Marne counteroffensive in July 1918, and at Blanquemont that October. His citation noted that he led his company through heavy machine gun fire to capture enemy positions, reorganized scattered units under direct fire, and continued the attack despite being wounded. Bruce understood what machine guns and artillery did to men who advanced in the open. He also understood that warfare was evolving faster than most officers could imagine. In 1941, General George Marshall brought Bruce into planning discussions about countering German armor. The German blitzkrieg had demonstrated the devastating power of massed tanks. France had collapsed in weeks despite fielding more tanks than Germany. Britain stood alone. The United States Army desperately needed a counter to the panzer divisions that had conquered Europe, and Marshall believed Bruce was the man to create it. Bruce's vision was radical. He argued that tanks should not fight tanks. That was a waste of expensive armored vehicles that were needed for offensive exploitation operations. Instead, specialized anti-tank units should be held in reserve at corps or army level, then rushed forward at high speed to intercept enemy armor at decisive points. These units needed one thing above all else: speed. Not armor, not overwhelming firepower. Speed. His logic was counterintuitive but internally consistent. A tank destroyer did not need to survive a direct hit from an enemy gun. It needed to avoid being hit in the first place. If it could reach the battlefield faster than the enemy expected, Find a concealed firing position behind a ridge or in a tree line. Destroy enemy tanks from ambush before they knew they were being engaged. And relocate before return fire arrived. Then armor became irrelevant. Why carry protection you would never need? Speed was the new armor. Concealment was the new shield. The first shot from an unexpected direction was the only shot that mattered. The army establishment was deeply skeptical. Career armor officers believed tanks should fight tanks in the European tradition. They pointed to German success with heavily armored vehicles. They argued that crews needed protection to fight effectively, that morale would collapse in vehicles that could not survive hits. But Bruce had Marshall's backing, and Marshall had President Roosevelt's ear. In November 1941, Marshall ordered the establishment of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center. Bruce selected a remote location in Texas after an extensive survey and named it Camp Hood after Confederate General John Bell Hood. The installation would later be renamed Fort Hood and eventually Fort Cavazos, but in 1941 it was empty scrubland that Bruce would transform into the training center for a new kind of soldier. The motto Bruce chose for his new force captured everything: seek, strike, destroy. Find the enemy before he finds you. Hit him hard while he is still trying to figure out where the fire is coming from. Disappear before he can respond. This was not the doctrine of the cavalry charge or the armored breakthrough. This was the doctrine of the ambush predator. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair became the doctrine's most powerful champion at the highest levels of the Army. McNair commanded Army ground forces from March 1942, making him responsible for how the entire American Army trained and fought. General Marshall called him the brains of the Army, and the nickname stuck. McNair believed anti-tank guns were the most economical means to defeat enemy armor, freeing American tanks for the offensive operations that would actually win the war. He issued specific directives emphasizing speedy and aggressive action to search out and attack opposing tanks before they had assumed formation. He wanted tank destroyers hitting German armor while the Panzers were still road marching, still deploying, still vulnerable. The doctrine was codified in Field Manual 18-5, published in June 1942. The foreword stated the mission with absolute clarity. There is but one battle objective of tank destroyer units, this being plainly inferred by their designation. It is the destruction of hostile tanks. But doctrine needed a weapon, and the weapons available in 1941 and early 1942 were inadequate for the mission Bruce and McNair envisioned. The development journey began in December 1941 with a vehicle designated T-42. It mounted a 37mm gun, already considered too weak against modern tanks, and used Christie suspension, the same high-speed system that gave Soviet BT tanks their legendary mobility. By April 1942, the Army wanted something more powerful. The T-49 carried a 57mm gun on coil spring suspension. That summer, engineers pushed further still. The T-67 mounted a 75mm gun in an open turret, powered by twin Buick engines producing 330 horsepower. Testing showed promise, but the gun was already being overtaken by German armor improvements. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans were fielding tanks with frontal armor that 75mm guns could not reliably penetrate. Still not enough. In January 1943, the Ordnance Department directed development of the definitive version, designated T-70. This vehicle featured torsion bar suspension for smoother cross-country travel and better crew comfort during long movements. It mounted a Continental R-975 radial engine, the same type that powered many American aircraft, producing 350 horsepower in early versions and 400 horsepower with supercharging in later production. Most importantly, the T-70 carried the 76mm gun, a significant improvement over the 75mm weapons that equipped most American armor. This was the same gun that would later arm up gunned Sherman tanks, giving American forces their first weapon capable of threatening German heavy armor at reasonable combat ranges. The vehicle emerged from an unlikely source, Harley Earl's design studio at Buick Motor Division in Flint, Michigan. Earl was famous for styling civilian Buicks with their sweeping fenders and chrome trim. Now his team created a war machine. They also designed the Wildcat logo that would adorn the vehicle and its crew's patches, giving the design a distinctive identity. The name came from Buick's publicity department. They called their creation the Hellcat. Testing occurred at General Motors' Milford Proving Ground, using standard automotive methods alongside military evaluations. Vehicles were run on banked oval tracks and bump courses. They forded 6 feet of water. They rammed structures to test hull integrity. The first T-70 pilot was delivered in April 1943. Production began that July at the Buick plant in Flint. Workers on the assembly line built the vehicles using automotive mass production techniques refined over decades of civilian manufacturing. These were methods German industry could not match, despite Germany's reputation for engineering excellence. At peak output, in November 1943, 267 Hellcats rolled off the assembly line in a single month. By October 1944, when production ended, 2,507 M18 Hellcats had been completed. The original plan called for nearly 9,000 vehicles, but production was curtailed for several reasons. The 76mm gun was proving inadequate against the latest German armor. The army was reducing the number of self-propelled Tank Destroyer Battalions. Allied partners showed little interest in the vehicle for Lend-Lease, with only 2 going to Britain and 5 to the Soviet Union. The specifications that emerged read like a contradiction designed by madmen, or perhaps by men who understood something their critics did not. The Hellcat's governed maximum speed was 55 miles per hour on roads, though sustained speeds typically reached about 50 miles per hour. This was achieved through an innovative 900T Torque-matic automatic transmission, one of the first automatic transmissions in any military vehicle. Drivers did not need to master complex manual shifting techniques. They simply pointed the vehicle and drove. Cross-country speed reached 26 miles per hour over broken terrain. No tank in any army could match this performance. The Sherman topped out at 30 miles per hour on roads under ideal conditions. The Panther managed 34 miles per hour when its notoriously unreliable transmission and final drives cooperated. The Tiger crawled at 25 miles per hour and often broke down attempting sustained road marches. The Hellcat could outrun anything on the battlefield. It could reach a threatened sector while German tanks were still moving up. It could break contact and escape when circumstances turned unfavorable. Speed was not merely a tactical advantage. Speed was a strategic capability that changed what tank destroyers could do. The vehicle weighed approximately 17 metric tons combat loaded, roughly 37,500 pounds. This was half the weight of a Sherman, 1/3 the weight of a Tiger. Less than 40% of a Panther's mass. The power-to-weight ratio was extraordinary for any armored vehicle of the era. But the armor terrified anyone who examined the specifications closely. The hull front measured just 12.7 millimeters, angled steeply to provide some protection through deflection, half an inch of steel between the crew and enemy fire. The turret front, the thickest point on the entire vehicle, was only 25.4 millimeters, 1 inch. The turret top was completely open to the sky, leaving crews exposed to artillery airbursts, mortar fragments, grenades, and weather. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground produced sobering results. 9 of 30 armor-piercing .30 caliber rifle bullets penetrated the turret side at 75 yards. A standard infantry rifle could kill the crew under the right conditions. Every machine gun on the battlefield could destroy this vehicle. Every tank gun, every anti-tank gun, every infantry Panzer Faust could penetrate its armor at any practical range. Even rifle grenades posed a lethal threat. Compare this to the vehicles the Hellcat would face. The Panther's frontal armor could defeat any American tank gun at ranges beyond a few hundred yards. The Tiger's 100mm face required point-blank engagement to penetrate reliably. The Hellcat's armor would stop nothing heavier than small arms fire at any range. The 76mm gun provided genuine killing power, but with significant limitations that crews had to understand. Standard M62, armor-piercing, capped rounds could penetrate approximately 88mm of armor at 1,000 yards when striking at 30 degrees from perpendicular, the standard measurement angle. The rare high-velocity armor-piercing tungsten-cored rounds, designated M93, could penetrate roughly 135mm under the same conditions. Against German armor, these numbers meant the Hellcat could reliably destroy a Panther or Tiger from the side or rear at reasonable combat ranges. The Panther's side armor was only 40 to 50mm. The Tiger's flanks were 80mm. Either could be penetrated by the 76mm gun at combat ranges if the crew could achieve a flanking shot. But frontal engagement was nearly suicidal for the Hellcat crew. The Panther's sloped glacis plate could not be penetrated by standard 76mm ammunition at any practical combat range. Period. The mathematics of armor penetration and plate angle made it impossible. The Tiger's flat 100mm front was theoretically vulnerable within 500 yards, but combat conditions rarely allowed such precise range estimation, and the Tiger crew would not be sitting idle while a Hellcat drove into knife-fighting range. Meanwhile, German guns were devastating at all ranges. An 88mm round from a Tiger, or the long 75mm from a Panther, could penetrate the Hellcat at essentially any range where the German gunner could see the target. There was no safe distance for a Hellcat crew facing a German tank frontally. Hellcat crews learned the brutal mathematics quickly during training. They could kill anything from the flank or rear. They could kill nothing from the front, and anything could kill them from any angle at any range. The doctrine demanded that crews embrace this asymmetry rather than fear it. Do not stand and fight. Do not trade shots. Do not attempt the heroic duel that tank warfare mythology celebrated. Appear, fire, vanish, hit and run, shoot and scoot. The open-topped turret that seemed like a death sentence actually gave commanders vastly better situational awareness than crews buttoned up inside German tanks. Hellcat commanders could see 360 degrees without relying on limited vision blocks or periscopes. They could hear engines approaching and tracks squealing around corners. They could smell exhaust that might signal nearby vehicles. They could react faster because they could perceive faster. By spring 1944, Camp Hood had trained over 100 Tank Destroyer Battalions, comprising tens of thousands of men. Andrew Bruce had left in May 1943 to command the 77th Infantry Division in the Pacific Theater, but the force he created continued growing under his successors. These men understood their vehicles and their doctrine. They had practiced the tactics endlessly on the firing ranges and maneuver areas of central Texas. They knew they were not tankers. They were hunters. In July 1944, Leslie McNair travelled to France to observe Operation Cobra, the massive breakout from the Normandy beachhead. On July 25, American bombers attempted to carpet-bomb German positions to enable the ground assault. Some bombs fell short of their intended targets. McNair was at a forward observation post with the 30th Infantry Division, trying to see how his training programs had prepared American soldiers for combat. A bomb struck his position. McNair was killed instantly, becoming the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. His death was initially kept secret because he was playing a key role in a deception operation, commanding the fictional 1st United States Army Group that convinced Germans that Normandy was a feint. He never saw the doctrine he had championed tested in the great armoured battles that would follow. That test came 2 months later in the fields of Lorraine. The Battle of Arracourt began on September 18, 1944, in conditions that negated every German advantage. Thick fog rose from the Moselle and Seine rivers, reducing visibility to 30 feet in some areas. German tanks could not use their superior range. German gunners could not identify targets beyond point-blank distance. The visibility that enabled Panther crews to destroy Shermans at 2,000 meters was gone. The German force included the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. Newly formed units fielding factory-fresh Panthers and Panzer IVs rushed from German assembly plants. These were powerful formations on paper. In reality, their crews had received minimal training before being thrown into combat. Many could not read maps properly. Some had never fired their main guns in realistic exercises. They faced the veteran 4th Armoured Division under Combat Command A, part of General George Patton's 3rd Army. Tank support came from Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, later the general for whom the M1 Abrams tank would be named, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion. Anti-tank firepower came from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion with 36 meters 18 Hellcats, crewed by men who had trained for exactly this moment. The fog changed everything the Germans expected. Panthers could engage Shermans at 2,000 meters in clear weather, far beyond the range where American guns posed any threat to their frontal armor. Their long 75mm guns were devastatingly accurate at ranges where American weapons were ineffective. But in 30-foot visibility, range advantage meant nothing. The engagement would be fought at distances where the Hellcat's 76mm gun was absolutely lethal against side armor. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper led a platoon of 4 M18s from Company C toward Hill 246, near the village of Recipient at 7:45 on the morning of September 19. His vehicles moved carefully through the murk, crews straining to see any shape that might be friend or enemy. They took up positions on the height. Then a German tank gun muzzle materialized 30 feet away. Sergeant Stacy commanded the lead Hellcat. He did not hesitate. He fired instantly, and the German tank exploded before its crew could react. A second Panzer emerged from the fog, trying to identify what had killed the first vehicle. Stacy destroyed it too. A third German tank managed to put a round into Stacy's M18, wounding his crew, but they drove their damaged vehicle out under its own power, rather than abandoning it. Another Hellcat in the platoon killed the tank that had hit Stacy. In approximately 5 minutes, 5 German tanks were burning hulks on the hillside. Leiper pulled his surviving vehicles to a neighboring height and spotted a column of Panzers on the road between Arracourt and Bastogne, still moving as if they did not realize they were driving into a kill zone. His Hellcats opened fire while radioing for artillery support. American guns added their weight to the ambush. Sergeant Henry Hartman became the engagement's outstanding performer. His single M18 destroyed 6 German tanks during the morning's fighting, most of them Panthers that outweighed his vehicle by nearly 3-1. He used the fog to close range, fired into vulnerable flanks, and repositioned before the surviving Germans could coordinate a response. By day's end, Leiper's platoon of 4 tank destroyers had knocked out at least 14 enemy vehicles, while losing 3 M18s damaged or destroyed. The mathematics that should have favored the Germans had completely reversed. Captain Thomas Evans commanded Company C and orchestrated a devastating flanking tactic. He used his lead platoon to attract German attention, letting them engage and draw fire. When the Panthers turned to face the apparent threat, they exposed their thinner side armor to Evans's other platoons, sprinting into flanking positions from different directions. The Germans could not turn fast enough. Their manual turret traverse could not track Hellcats moving at 40 miles per hour across their field of fire. By the time a Panther's gun pointed at one threat, that Hellcat was gone, and another was firing into its opposite flank. The fighting continued through September 29, 1944. German commanders threw attack after attack against the American positions, expecting weight of armor to eventually overwhelm lighter defenders. Each attack followed the same pattern. Panthers advanced confidently forward, expecting to overwhelm American forces with superior protection and firepower. Hellcats appeared on their flanks from unexpected directions, fired into vulnerable sides, then vanished into the fog or behind ridgelines before the heavy turrets could swing around. General Blaskowitz grew furious with his Panzer commanders. He issued sharp reprimands for lacking offensive spirit. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, tried to convince Blaskowitz that the offensive was hopeless given American tactics and the impossible visibility conditions. Blaskowitz refused to listen. The attacks continued. More Panthers burned. Hellcat crews at Arracourt discovered a critical tactical innovation through deadly trial and error. A well-placed shot between the mantlet and glacis plate of a Panther, hitting the gap where the gun housing met the hull front, would ricochet downward into the driving compartment, killing the driver and co-driver, even when direct penetration of the heavy frontal armor was impossible. This workaround spread rapidly through the Tank Destroyer Battalions as crews shared hard-won knowledge. The final tally for the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion at Arracourt was devastating for the Germans. 39 enemy tanks destroyed for 4 M18s destroyed and 3 more damaged. A ratio approaching 6-1 that validated what the Tank Destroyer doctrine had always claimed possible. 2 entire German Panzer brigades, the formations that were supposed to throw Patton's army back across the Moselle, were crippled as coherent fighting forces. Captain Thomas Evans would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for actions on November 22, 1944, near Moyenvic, France, when he manned the gun of a disabled M18 and personally destroyed 2 enemy tanks while under direct fire. He also received Bronze Stars for his earlier actions. His experiences were later published in 1995 in a book titled Reluctant Valor, which remains a primary source for understanding what tank destroyer combat was actually like. But Arracourt was not an anomaly or a fortunate accident. 3 months later, in very different conditions, the Hellcat would prove itself again at a crossroads in Belgium that would become one of the most famous stands in American military history. When the German Ardennes offensive struck on December 16, 1944, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton was in 9th Army Reserve, 60 miles north of the breakthrough zone. No one expected the Germans to attack through the frozen forests of the Ardennes in winter. The Germans attacked anyway. Ordered south immediately as the scope of the offensive became clear, the battalion raced toward Bastogne, the critical road junction that both sides recognized as essential to controlling the region. The 705th was formally attached to the 101st Airborne Division on December 20, arriving to reinforce paratroopers who had reached the town just hours ahead of German spearheads. The most desperate early action came at Neuville, a small village north of Bastogne, on December 19 and 20. 4 M18s from the 705th accompanied paratroopers of the 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, to reinforce Team Desobre, a mixed force from the 10th Armoured Division that was trying to delay the German advance. The high-speed run to Neuville was one of the few documented operational uses of the M18's full 55-mile-per-hour capability in combat conditions. The Hellcats raced north ahead of the advancing 2nd Panzer Division, reaching the village in time to establish fighting positions before German armour arrived in force. The combined American force at Neuville, including Shermans from Team Desobre, M18s from the 705th and 609th Tank Destroyer Battalions, paratroopers from the Airborne Infantry, and supporting artillery, fought a desperate delaying action that destroyed approximately 30 German tanks and inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking force. The Hellcat's ability to fire from one position, sprint at high speed to another, and reappear on a completely different approach convinced the Germans they faced a much larger armoured force than actually defended the village. The delay bought the 101st Airborne critical hours to organise Bastogne's all-around defences. On Christmas morning, 1944, German forces launched a major attack near the villages of Champs and Hemroul, attempting to break through to Bastogne from the west. Sergeant Lawrence Valletta commanded a Hellcat from the 705th's Reconnaissance Company. He rolled his M18 into Champs and systematically destroyed buildings, sheltering German infantry, using his 76mm gun as direct-fire artillery. He knocked out multiple machine gun positions that were pinning down American paratroopers. When 18 Panzer IVs of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division advanced on Hemroul in the most serious armoured thrust of Christmas Day, the combined firepower of M18s from Company B, Sherman tanks, and paratroopers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment stopped them cold in the open fields. Virtually the entire German tank force was destroyed by the combined American defenders in what became one of the most lopsided defensive victories of the Bulge. Throughout the Bastogne siege from December 18 through January 18, 1945, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed approximately 40 German tanks while losing 6 Menas 18s. A ratio of roughly 7-to-1 achieved in some of the most desperate defensive fighting American forces experienced in Europe. The battalion received the Distinguished Unit Citation, later redesignated the Presidential Unit Citation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous Christmas message to the defenders of Bastogne specifically recognized the 705th as a worthy comrade alongside the paratroopers who have become synonymous with the defense. A broader statistic underscored the value of self-propelled tank destroyers in the Ardennes fighting. Of 119 American tank destroyers lost during the entire Battle of the Bulge, 86 were towed guns. Only 33 were self-propelled vehicles. The towed guns could not reposition quickly when circumstances changed. They could not exploit the shoot and scoot tactics that made the M18 effective. They could not escape when enemy forces threatened to overrun their positions. This disparity led directly to a January 1945 decision to convert all remaining towed tank destroyer battalions to self-propelled equipment as quickly as vehicles became available. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, who had led the 705th so effectively at Bastogne, was killed in action on March 1, 1945, during fighting in Germany. He never saw the final victory his battalion helped make possible. Other tank destroyer battalions wrote their own chapters in the M18's combat history across Europe and the Pacific. The The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was activated December 15, 1941, at Camp Pine, New York. Attached to the 4th Armored Division for most of the war, it became the first battalion in the European theatre equipped with M18s when it received the new vehicles in May 1944. The unit had actually tested the T-70 prototypes for Buick before production began, giving its crews months of experience with the vehicle before entering combat. Landing at Utah Beach on July 12 and 13, 1944, the 704th fought through Operation Cobra, the Lorraine campaign where Arracourt made it famous, the Ardennes counteroffensive, the Siegfried Line battles, and the final drive into Bavaria. Its total combat record included destruction of numerous enemy armored vehicles across 10 months of nearly continuous combat. The 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was activated in March 1941 and attached to the 6th Armored Division. It entered France at Utah Beach on July 21 and 22, 1944, and fought through Operation Cobra, the Brittany campaign, the fighting in Lorraine, and the Ardennes. Its most decorated soldier was Corporal Arthur Beyer of Company C, who received the Medal of Honor for actions on January 15, 1945, near Arracourt, Belgium. Beyer's citation describes extraordinary individual courage across an extended distance under fire. Using his M18's 76mm gun, he first silenced a machine gun position that was pinning down American infantry attempting to advance. Then he dismounted from his vehicle entirely and began a single-handed assault on enemy positions. He advanced 200 yards to destroy one machine gun nest, then continued 250 more yards to eliminate a second position. He worked his way along an enemy-held ridge for a quarter mile, killing 8 enemy soldiers in close combat and capturing 18 prisoners, including 2 bazooka teams that could have destroyed his tank destroyer if they had not been neutralized. President Harry Truman presented Beyer's Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony on August 23, 1945. The 603rd also participated in one of the war's most sobering moments. On April 11, 1945, elements of the battalion helped liberate Buchenwald concentration camp, witnessing firsthand the systematic horrors that American soldiers were fighting to end. The overall combat record of the M18 Hellcat across all theaters produced numbers that vindicated crews if not doctrine. According to Army, after action reports compiled by military historian Stephen Zaloga, M18 units claimed 526 enemy vehicles destroyed. 498 fell in the European theater. 17 were destroyed in Italy. 11 more were claimed in the Pacific theater against Japanese armor. Against these claims, 216 M18s were lost in combat. This produced an overall ratio of approximately 2.4 to 1, the highest claimed kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer in the Second World War. The paradox of the Hellcat was that it succeeded brilliantly at tasks for which it was not optimized, while the massed defensive anti-armor role it was specifically designed for rarely materialized as doctrine predicted. Post-war assessments were unsentimental about the doctrine that created the Hellcat. The European Theatre of Operations General Board studied 39 tank destroyer battalions and found they were almost never employed in their intended doctrinal role. The massed German armoured thrusts requiring centralised tank destroyer response that Bruce and McNair had anticipated rarely occurred by the time American forces were fully engaged in Europe. By 1944, Germany was largely on the defensive. Instead, tank destroyers were parcelled out to support infantry divisions piece by piece. They were used as mobile artillery. They were thrown into defensive positions where their thin armour became a liability rather than a speed advantage. They performed infantry support missions for which their open turrets made them vulnerable and their limited ammunition stowage made them inefficient. Infantry division commanders unanimously preferred tank battalion support over tank destroyer battalion support when surveyed after the war. Tanks could take hits that would destroy a Hellcat and keep fighting. Tanks had closed turrets that protected crews from the artillery fragments and small arms fire that dominated infantry combat. Tanks were more versatile across the full range of battlefield missions. The Stilwell Board delivered the definitive institutional judgment. The thin-skinned, self-propelled tank destroyer has too limited a role to warrant further development now that comparable gun power can be attained in tank development. Why build a specialized vehicle that could only fight tanks effectively when you could build a tank that could fight tanks and also survive infantry combat? The Tank Destroyer Center at Fort Hood, the institution Andrew Bruce had built from empty scrubland, closed on November 10, 1945. The last Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated in 1946. The doctrine that had created the Hellcat was formally abandoned. The entire Tank Destroyer branch ceased to exist as a distinct element of the Army. Military historian Christopher Gable, writing for the Army's Combat Studies Institute in a landmark study published in 1985, concluded that Tank Destroyer doctrine was fundamentally flawed from its origins. Its creators had formulated their doctrine with an imperfect understanding of combined arms mechanized warfare. They had created a doctrinal solution for a problem that did not exist as they perceived it. The mass Panzer attacks they planned to defeat never came in the form they expected. Historian Stephen Zaloga was even more direct in his assessment. He called the M18's design poorly balanced and credited its impressive combat record to the training and dedication of its crews rather than the wisdom of its designers. The men made it work, despite its limitations, not because of its intended capabilities. Yet the raw numbers told a more complicated story than simple doctrinal failure. When circumstances actually aligned with what the doctrine envisioned, at Arracourt in the fog where range advantages were nullified, at Nouville in the desperate race to hold Bastogne, the M18 was spectacularly effective. The 704th's performance at Arracourt and the 705th's crucial role holding Bastogne against armoured attacks demonstrated what the Hellcat could achieve when circumstances permitted proper employment. The failure was not the machine. The failure was the assumption that modern warfare would consistently provide opportunities to use the machine as its designers intended. The M18 Hellcat served on in foreign armies long after the American Tank Destroyer branch disappeared from memory. Yugoslavia received approximately 240 Hellcats through military assistance programs and kept them in reserve for decades as war stocks against potential invasion. These vehicles remained in storage through the Cold War. Then, in 1993, during the Yugoslav wars, Serbian forces demonstrated how long a well-maintained Hellcat could remain lethal. Railway workers in Knin created an improvised armoured train they called the Krajina Express by mounting weapons on reinforced flat cars. In 1993, they added an entire M18 Hellcat to the train, its 76mm gun still fully operational after 5 decades. The train also mounted 20mm and 40mm cannons, rocket pods, and anti-tank guided missiles. It operated in the Bihać area against Croatian and Bosnian forces until August 1995, when Croatia's Operation Storm overran Serbian positions in the Krajina region. The crew scuttled the train to prevent its capture, destroying it themselves rather than letting it fall into enemy hands. Taiwan operated over 200 MiG-18s as the backbone of its armoured forces through both Taiwan Strait crises in 1954 and 1958. The Hellcat's combination of speed and firepower proved well suited to the island's defensive needs and road network. When the vehicles finally retired from frontline service, Taiwanese engineers mounted their turrets on M42 Duster anti-aircraft vehicle chassis to create the Type 64 light tank, extending the Hellcat's combat potential into yet another generation of armoured vehicles. The M18 held the American military record for fastest tracked armoured fighting vehicle for nearly 4 decades, until the M1 Abrams main battle tank finally exceeded its road speed in the 1980s. The crews who fought in Hellcats scattered back to civilian life after the war ended. They returned to farms and factories and offices across America. They raised families and built careers and grew old. Most never spoke much about what they had done in vehicles that should have been death traps but somehow were not. The Tank Destroyer branch no longer existed. The vehicles they had fought in were scrapped or sold to foreign armies. The doctrine they had mastered was officially repudiated and forgotten. But some of them remembered. Veterans associations kept memories alive through reunions that continued for decades after the last shots were fired. The Tank Destroyer Association maintained records and published accounts that preserved stories that might otherwise have vanished entirely from historical memory. The lesson of what they accomplished should not be forgotten. The German misjudgment of American tank destroyers was not simply a failure of tactical intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. German commanders looked at American armoured vehicles and saw thin armour that could not stop their guns. They saw open turrets that exposed crews to fragments and weather. They saw vehicles that appeared hopelessly vulnerable by every standard that German armoured doctrine held dear. They did not see the doctrine that made thin armour irrelevant by avoiding the hits entirely. They did not see crews trained to fight an entirely different kind of battle than German Panzers were designed to win. They did not see the institutional flexibility that allowed American forces to adapt tactics to circumstances rather than forcing circumstances to fit predetermined tactical templates. The men who dismissed American tank destroyers as inadequately protected continued to believe in the supremacy of heavy armour, even as their Panthers and Tigers burned across the fields of France and Belgium. They trusted their assumptions about how armoured warfare should work more than they trusted the evidence burning before their eyes. History offers this lesson with uncomfortable regularity. Assumptions calcify into certainties. Experts become prisoners of their own expertise. The weapons and tactics that succeeded yesterday become the untouchable orthodoxy that fails tomorrow. The German generals who built the Tiger and Panther believed they understood armoured warfare better than anyone else in the world. They had conquered most of Europe with their methods. They had destroyed the armies of Poland, France, and a significant portion of the Soviet Union. They knew what worked because they had made it work. When they encountered something that did not fit their established understanding, they dismissed it as an American mistake rather than recognizing it as a deliberate challenge to everything they believed. Thin armor meant dead crews. Open turrets meant vulnerability. Speed could not substitute for protection. These were the lessons of their experience, and their experience was vast. The Americans who built the Hellcat understood something different. They understood that warfare rewards the force that adapts fastest to new circumstances. They understood that the next battle will not be fought exactly like the last one. They understood that courage and skill and the right circumstances can sometimes matter more than steel and firepower. This was not a uniquely American insight. It was simply an insight the Americans happened to grasp in this particular moment, creating a weapon that worked despite violating every principle its enemies held dear. The M18 Hellcat was messy and imperfect and doctrinally questionable. It was built for a tactical scenario that proved largely irrelevant to how the war actually unfolded. Its crews died in vehicles that could not protect them from the weapons they faced. Its designers made choices that seem indefensible when examined with hindsight. But it worked. In the fog at Arracourt, when visibility favored the ambusher. In the snow at Bastogne, when speed meant reaching the fight in time. Wherever crews found circumstances that matched their training and their doctrine, the Hellcat was devastating. The vehicles that German experts confidently dismissed as inadequate death traps compiled a kill ratio that no German tank of any weight class could match. The factories in Flint that built Hellcats have long since moved on to other products. The battlefields where they fought have been reploughed and replanted for 3/4 of a century. The men who crewed them have largely passed from living memory into history. But the story matters. It matters not because the M18 was a perfect weapon. It clearly was not. It matters not because tank destroyer doctrine was vindicated by events. It clearly was not vindicated in the form its creators intended. The story matters because it demonstrates something profound about how wars are actually won by nations and armies. Wars are not won by the side possessing the best weapons in isolation. Wars are won by the side that best matches its weapons to actual circumstances as they unfold. Wars are won by soldiers who adapt faster than their enemies to conditions nobody predicted. Wars are won by institutions that learn from failure rather than repeating comfortable assumptions. The German army in 1944 fielded better tanks than the Americans by most technical measures. German crews were often more experienced after years of combat on multiple fronts. German tactical doctrine was refined and proven by campaigns across 2 continents. By conventional analysis, Germany should have dominated armoured engagements against less protected American vehicles. They did not dominate. They lost. They lost because rigid assumptions blinded commanders to threats they refused to understand. They lost because doctrine could not adapt to unexpected tactical challenges. They lost because they built weapons optimized for the war they expected rather than the war that actually arrived. The M18 Hellcat was not the weapon anyone expected to succeed. It was too fast, too light, too exposed. It broke every principle that armored warfare experts had established through bloody experience. And in the hands of crews brave enough to exploit its unconventional strengths and smart enough to minimize its obvious weaknesses, it became one of the deadliest tank killers of the Second World War. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War with audiences who care about history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories that deserve to be remembered. Each story matters. Each sacrifice deserves recognition. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from today. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to historians and enthusiasts of military history. You are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching with us, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for generations who will never know the men who lived them.